Hey, welcome to More Christ. Today I'm joined by the wonderful philosopher and author Wayne Cristaudo. Professor Wayne's award combines a study of the nature of human beings, the history and nature of ideas and social and political institutions, as well as how these all impact on the different characters of peoples and of nations. And his work is really about philosophy as a way of life and a way of love, I think, if I did it justice. So then, just to begin, Wayne, can you tell us a little bit about your background, please, and some of the key events in your life that helped to form you and your love for Christ and his way of love, which seems to come across in your work?
Okay, so where to start exactly? Okay, I'll start from when I finished school. I go to university, I'm completely lost, and some guy says to me, what are you doing? I said, I haven't a clue. What are you doing? And he said, I'm going to do this subject called modern political ideologies. And the reason I give this example is I think life constantly turns around these unexpected, surprising moves that you make that are completely unintended, that shape your life in ways you have no idea of what it will do. So a big part of the way I think is I am really opposed to any way of thinking that tries to put overarching plans in place as if life was conformity to that. You know, the famous John Lennon quote, life is what happens when you're doing other things. Yeah. Okay, when you're making other plans. So he said that, and I was very lost at university. I didn't know what I wanted to do. I thought I wanted to do journalism and law. And this particular lecturer, who I didn't have any personal bond with, but he was a great lecturer, and the stories he told led me to just want to read these thinkers. And I remember the first thinker I read in depth is John Locke, not someone now I feel particularly close to, but I was amazed to see someone put together an argument that was basically a book in length. And I was astounded by that. I'd done public speaking and debating at school, but when I saw this really touched me. And then I recall being in the library after I'd been trying to make sense of Hegel. And this was in my first or second year university. And I was in the library where the Hegel books were and the Fichte books were, and I just felt overwhelmed and dizzy by this sense of something important. And it really was one of those life-changing moments. And then later, and I was kind of in between being a pretty bad student, but there's an interest in these these philosophers, which, by the way, they weren't even being taught in the philosophy department, because back then I was at the University of Queensland, so this is in the early to mid 70s, and philosophy was very analytic, and nothing they did remotely interested me. And so I was doing, you know, this subject on political ideology, and then I just started wandering in my own way, and my life has kind of been that way. So I found subjects I could do where I didn't actually have to sit through any curriculum. I could choose the books that I wanted to. And I remember once, just a sense of calling, I suppose. I went to Nimbin, which was this great New Age festival in Australia in the early 70s. And I was hitchhiking there, and someone said, oh yeah, what are you doing? And I said, I'm going to go to Germany to study philosophy. And that I don't know where that came from. It just came out of my mouth. And about 7 or 8 years later, when I'm in Germany studying philosophy, at the University of Freiburg, I think, you know, I knew that before I did it. And I think one of the things that's interested me over time is not only the lack of intention in the way things are done and the spontaneity of things, but the way in which we have intonation of things without even recognizing it till it's come out of our mouth, and we somehow know that this is the way that we must go. And so I just kept studying. I didn't have any, God, I don't want to go on too long with this. Tell me if this gets boring. You know, this, I suppose this is my story, but I went along, I'll try to consolidate it, but I was drifting, but the drift was always towards wanting to just find out more and more. And I remember I took a year off my third year university, and I was living in a hovel playing music. And I remember just writing in a book an exercise book, all the thinkers I wanted to study, and I wrote down their names. I thought, yes, I've got to read all these people. This is what I've got to do. And you know, the last book I wrote in my academic career was basically the fulfillment of what then I had a sense of I had to do. So that was driving me. And then I learned Greek, and I learned, which I've mainly forgotten, and read Plato. And I did a master's degree on Nietzsche and Plato, and the supervisor had no real interest in me or the project. And I went off to England and then Germany to learn German. And here was an interesting thing that happened. I just think of these little weird things that happen in life, right? So I've just written a master's thesis on Nietzsche and Plato, and I'm in this small island in Sifnos in the Cyclades in Greece, and I'm in this. I met this artist there, and I'm in this little kind of hovel where he was living in, and I just pick up a book, and it was a collected writings of Plato translated by Benjamin Jowett, in which in the margin, all these Nietzschean comments of the sort that had been the content of my thesis. And it was like, huh? How is this possible? It's like, you know, Nietzsche's acolyte, this person who had just imbibed Nietzsche, reading Plato, making all these comments, was writing this stuff. And it was the same as the thesis. Anyway, then I went to Adelaide to decide I wanted to learn the history of philosophy. And I decided I would do a project, which again was a template of my book. I would do a project that would enable me to understand the repertoire, the history, or the flow of the history of philosophy. So very philosophical. And I was doing this, and I wrote this thesis on Descartes, Kant, Hegel, and Marx. And at the end of it, I was like a head. I actually think philosophy is a very dangerous thing. And because I think it deludes people. And that's something we can talk about later, but it's everything, every way of communicating, exploring the imagination, everything we do, every encounter is really an exploration. And philosophy began for me as an exploration, but the further I got into it and was working through these systems, especially Kant and Hegel, spent a lot of time on those Germans. It was really someone putting himself up saying, I've figured it out. This is it. And if you do this and you line things up, and if we all kind of stand here and look here, we can see this is the way things are. And you're standing on your head in a bucket of water with a whirly bird hat, trying to just see that. And I did all that. And at the end of it, my life just fell apart at the end of that. And I had noticed that I couldn't really talk about anything. Now I can talk about lots of things. I felt I couldn't really, I just felt completely disassociated from my life in the world. And I had to break up my life. And it was very sad and, you know, personally very sad. Breaking up a marriage, and I'm still very close friends with my first wife. And that's another story in itself of how love works and all of that. But anyway, I really got lost. And in that lostness, and I do mention this at the beginning, obliquely, in a little book I wrote called Power, Love and Evil, which was a very important book for me to write, because it was a really decision to break with the academic way of doing things, and in a sense to break with philosophy in the way that I had done it, which was I'd learned all these systems, and I thought these systems are going to help me understand reality. And my marriage breaks up. I've just got a university job. I'm thinking, what is this for? And around that time, I started reading Kierkegaard, and he really spoke to me. I liked the intensity and the passion. And I think what had happened is I'd become so cerebral that anything to do with passion was a way back into life. And at around that same time, so I just got, or just about to get my first academic post as a lecturer. I'd been a tutor, which was a way in, but it wasn't a permanent position. I'm walking along in a bookshelf in the library, just running my hands. It's all chance. Everything I'm saying is chance. And I'm walking along and I pick up a book called Law and Revolution. Now, why I stopped, I did have a sense that I would, if I got this job, I'd probably have to do something to do with law, and my only way of having looked at law before was through philosophy, so it's a sort of jurisprudence kind of thing, even though I had started doing law as a first-year student and failed it because I used to never attend lectures and drink and go off and try to understand Victor and Hegel and things like that. Anyway, this book, it was about the investiture conflict, and it really, I just loved it. And I remember I picked it up, started reading, and I used to catch a tram and I was walking home. So this was before I really had a breakdown. So these things were happening sort of all together. But I'm walking along reading this book through the streets of Adelaide, and this so spoke to me. And then I noticed a footnote, and the footnote was to this guy called Rosenstock-Huessy. So a couple of days later, I go into the library, and I see they've got 5 or 6 books by Rosenstock-Huessy. By the way, that's extraordinary. And I found out about 10 years ago, I met the guy that had ordered the books on Rosenstock-Huessy for the Adelaide Library in the 1970s. So some years, a few years, about 5 or 6 years before, or 8 years before I, picked up that book. Anyway, I go and see his book called Out of Revolution. I open the page, and the first sentence is, "Our passions give life to the world. The history of humankind is the history of its passions." And I almost had to shut the book and go away and think about it. And it had such an impression on me. So this was happening as my life is falling apart. And that involved, I won't go into the details, but later a love affair with a very damaged young woman who kind of helped me see. I'm very grateful for her, even though we don't speak or anything. I'm so grateful to her because all the abstractness that I've been carrying around, it's like cut through that. And in some ways, she really taught me about evil. And that was never something I'd ever thought of other than in kind of moral categories. And I came later to think the kind of language around morality that we use for morality is just a really terrible language. And so at this stage, Kierkegaard, Rosenstock-Huessy, they were showing me the value, and reading the Bible, the value of that sinewy, bony, flinty Old Testament language, which is also real. And what I could see is that language spoke to my experience, and that the language of abstraction was just a lie. I put it that bluntly. It's a distraction. And in fact, I think abstraction is distraction. It can help a little bit if you're not too distracted, and you recognize it's kind of generalization to kind of do a little bit with, but if you take it too far, you succumb to it, you get lost to it. So that was really my way into the Christian life, not so much my life as a Christian, but the examples of, and especially of Kierkegaard, but even more so Rosenstock-Huessy. He became a kind of ally, a friend to me in this dark night, and I was really at a very depressed state, and at times I didn't even want to get out of bed. And then again, other encounters happened. So, for example, because I then ordered all these books on Rosenstock-Huessy, and I had a grant, and so I could buy all this stuff. And I didn't know then that Rosenstock-Huessy's grandson and his wife were partly operating a little in-house outlet for a publisher, a small publishing company that had been set up by one of Rosenstock-Huessy's students called Argo Press. So here's this guy from Adelaide ordering all these books that I'm wanting this to speak. I'm trying to make sense of a life falling apart. I'm seeing some films and reading other books that are conveying something of what I'm going through. And here is Rosenstock-Huessy with this great big historical picture, who, the rarest of things, he combines this tremendous erudition with great psychological acumen. My feeling generally is the more learned someone is, often the less psychologically astute they are. In my experience, most academics are really psychologically dead. They've lost something. They've really lost it. And that's because they're carrying all this stuff around in here, but the rest of it, and of course, marriages break up and the kids happen and all that. So in a sense, reality keeps trying to give them an opportunity to be vital, to be alive, but the brain gets in the way. And Rosenstock-Huessy he really gave me something, and his love for the Christian life, that changed my life. And I'm not even sure, and I always thought, I could really identify with Johannes de Silentio in Fear and Trembling, someone who's not a Christian, but loves that, who sees that, the truth in that. And from Rosenstock-Huessy, what I learned was the truth of this way. And it's not a principle, it's not a truth in which you can cash out in principles that you bring along Aquinas or someone to argue the case for. For me, that's wrong. And there's many things. Look, someone like Aquinas, I know he's a genius and there's many things to love. But to me, this is all about the contingency. It was where your own soul is at, that something can speak to you. Because I know other students of mine, other people, they look at Rosenstock and they scratch their head. This is lunatic. They just think he's crazy. Whereas I just think, well, how could you, can't you get it? Why don't you get that? And some of the more educated, they like Franz Rosenzweig, who's Rosenstock's friend. We might talk about that a bit later if you're interested, who's much more in the game. And he's very real in the way he does things, but that is, I want to say, the way he thinks about life is certainly affects everything he writes. But with Rosenstock-Huessy, he really spoke to me, and he showed me the way in which I could see my own experiences as making sense. So things like sin or rebirth or redemption, these no longer were metaphors for me. These were things I could see in my life. So the language, in fact, I feel somewhat caught between a language of metaphor and a language of conceptualization. And philosophers, we use a language of conceptualization, and I think all of this is just trying to convey something that's always opaque. And if you use a language of conceptualization, you deal with the opacity by constant qualification. If you deal with a language of image, you deal with a kind of intensified and internal language which speaks to you. And either you use the language in a way, I'll give another example, for example, another kind of example. One thing that drives me nuts is when I see, and some very prestigious authors, writing about doctrinal disputes within the history of the church, and speaking about the dispute as if it's a kind of intellectual A or B or C. And to me, this is nuts. It's what we're talking about is ritual and decision around devotion and its meaning and the kind of people that are being made with this as opposed to those kind of people. So there's a whole sociological, anthropological, imaginative dimension to this, that if you just discuss it, for example, I'll say, like Rowan Williamson, talk about the Arius concept. I hated it. I couldn't stand it. It drove me nuts because I think he's talking about everything except the important bit. And the important bit you can only get to if you think of it viscerally, if you try and use your imagination to enter that world. So entering into the world. So let me try and sum up. So I went from philosophy to having an academic job, thinking, or trying to make sense of my life and trying to convey that in my teaching and then in my writing. So I went from writing, I could have made a far better academic career, being a Hegel scholar, a Kant scholar, or, one of them, or a Nietzsche scholar, or whatever. And then writing the kind of book that I see most academics write. And then in the midst of that, and I taught a course which was the biggest course in the arts faculty at the time, called Justice, Law and the State. Now, it was the biggest course, not because I was such a legend. Students said that sometimes, but let me balance that. When I went to the University of Hong Kong, they thought I was crap because I didn't understand anything. Pride always comes before a fall. It wasn't because of that, though. It was because these kids wanted to go and study law, and I set up a pretty decent course. But after doing it for 3 years, I thought, I don't believe this is useful for anybody. So I then offered a course it was in politics, and it had nothing to do with politics, really. It was called Power, Love and Evil, which was the name of the book. And it took me a long time to work on that. And then I started trying to think through that. And it was a good place to be because I was so depressed. I was in such a dire straits. All this stuff about evil and the innocuous nature of discussions around morality and justice, not always, but frequently, especially in the academic, rarefied way of doing it. A genuine act of injustice where X wants Y and is angry with Z for, that's real. But the more abstract we start talking about things like equality, or it just all gets lost. So I really wanted to bring my students with me to induct them into a way of seeing the powers of life and your own life. And power in a very non-modern sense of it, because the modern deployment, our understanding of that term, much closer to the spirits and the gods, the God, all these ways that deal with the forces of the languages that we have and the way in which the forces of life operate within us. So that's became what interested me. And then love, its role. And there were some other books that I'd been reading at that time. I'll just mention Brian Keenan's Evil Cradling. I don't know if you know that wonderful work. Rian Milan's My Traitor's Heart, a little novel called Damage, very, very powerful and interesting, by Josephine Hart. And I think all of these were the book on Gary Gilmore by his brother Michael Gilmore called A Shot in the Heart. All of these books to me in some ways were testimonies, and they all were talking about the same thing, even though the surface of them was completely different. And then that just changed everything. And then everything after that, in a sense, is secondary to what it's very long, that's a very long. I'll see you tomorrow, I can tell.
No, thank you so much. Thanks for sharing that, Wayne. That's most insightful, I should say. And I don't understate that either. So I want to ask you next, if I may, a little bit about St. Augustine. So what you're recounting there sounds very Augustinian in some ways, if I may put it that way. And I want to ask maybe about why or how he's been a key figure and in what ways he's done that for you.
Look, I don't need to speak for hours about Augustine. I love Augustine. I love the fact that I just love the formulation original sin, which is original mess up. We make our lives out of our mess. It's out of the crap we do, not the gold we bring to the table, but the clearing up operation. You see, one of the reasons that the Greek tradition dissatisfies me and why I see its rejuvenation and its dominance in our world are so terrible is because it starts with the idea, as I said, if you get the position right, you get it's like an astronomer. If you get the stars in alignment, we all line up, then we all do this together, then it'll all work out. And if we live our lives right, if you know first of all, we've got to know what virtue is, because we might know what virtue is, so we need someone to tell us what virtue is. Oh, really? That's virtue. Oh, great. That's really good. But I'm going to go and kick a ball or hit a bat, hit the ball. I want to act. I have to act. And how much virtue I've got when I act, I don't know, because a circumstance is going to come along. Am I prepared? And all this training, it's a little bit like kindergarten. It's a bit like tricycle, the wheels on a bicycle, the little extra wheels, it's like, well, yes. But the Christian tradition says, emphasizes the act, and it's they're not really righteousness, yes. So there is it's not like you're going out cold into the wilderness. There's some guidance, but at the end of the day, you pray. This to me is really powerful. You pray because you don't know. You're not going to ever be that well prepared. Life is something's going to happen like that. You're not prepared for it. How you respond is everything. And Augustine says, original sin, you'll mess up. And people look at me at conferences, I go to academic conferences, and I will just say, they'll say something, or they'll say something about, sneering. I remember this Jewite, and he had been, this was in Hong Kong, he was a very nice guy, but he had been an evangelical who then found John Dewey. I thought, what a come down. At least the evangelical says, there's poetry and music. John Dewey, oh God. If that's the world, I want to die now. And he said something about original sin, sneer. I said, you don't believe in original sin? And it's like, what? I said, oh, so someone who hasn't messed up? Please, I want to meet them. Where are they? And what's the trick? You're telling me John Dewey hasn't? And of course, you see, well, of course, you missed the mark. Sin, you missed the mark. We all missed the mark. And it's not only that we missed the mark, if we move our sight away from intention and look at world, we see it's just full of picking up the pieces. That's all we're doing, is we're picking up the pieces. And yes, you get a few bright sparks and say, put it over there, or put it there, or put it this way. Great, but it's the pieces precede us. All our problems come from the pieces that have been created by everyone else's original sin. So when some bright enlightenment spark comes along and says, oh, real good, or Pelagius, real good, he should have been beaten to death. No, that's a bit strong, but it's just so, I find it just so silly. It's just so pompous and silly to believe that we're not frail creatures. And Augustine, I think, his focus upon frailty, the moment in which he says all the doctrinal disputations he's caught up with, I think he's always astute and brilliant about the other positions and why that's not the way to go. And I think he's the incarnation of three types at a particular moment in history that, possibly without his presence, it would have been completely different. Very few people matter that much. I think he really matters. And I think he's got the philosophical wisdom or insight of a Plato. And given the doctrinal disputations, you can see why philosophy would be useful in helping navigate that. So he's got a religious sensibility of a Paul, the faith that drives him. And even though this is not one of my heroes, I have to give it to him in terms of riding fortune and navigating political winds. He's got the political nose of a Lenin. So that combination is a very, very rare thing. I can't think of anyone else in philosophy who's got all three of those. Kierkegaard, you might say that the two out of three, which is good, but Augustine's unique. And I think, the time's calling for, here's an institution that is binding people in, a terrible time, in a kind of outbreak of warlordism, and in which the church is able to provide a means of solace and building between people. And I think Augustine provides insights, and particularly doctrinal things. And he comes up, and the other thing, apart from evil and, the two cities, that his teaching about love, I just think that's really on the money for me too. It's that what we make comes out of what we love. And basically for Augustine, the rapist just loves raping. That's why they've done it. We don't need, why they ended up there, that you could ask that. There might be all sorts of, I'm not saying there's not a story there, but at some point, the twisted nature or the twists in our nature can make us love things that are diabolical. And things that look like they're not diabolical. I think, for example, I think loving abstraction is diabolical. I think the diabolical nature of the world around us that we see in our modern variations, you know, for me, human beings are constantly finding ways in which their misdirected loves damage us, and they block out, and this is something I find extremely powerful in the Christian tradition, is the idea of the open self, that the self that closes itself is closing itself off from God. And it wants to be an all. It's pride, you know, the Milton, well, not just Milton, but pride. That's the enemy. And will, pride, willfulness, closure. These are all things I think operate together. And Augustine, I think, provides a powerful psychological, it's kind of philosophical, but I don't even, stuff like this, you either get it or you don't. I don't think, if I'm having a conversation with someone and they really do think that people are good and they can't see that people mess up, and I say, well, have you met them all? And they start, well, what can you say? Okay, good, you're great, your children are blessed, you know, you'll know everything and they'll know everything and good on you. So that's why I love Augustine. And it's funny because I think, I often say this to students, I think amongst the greatest psychologists, I'd put Augustine and the Marquis de Sade. And I think the Marquis de Sade, I used to teach de Sade, and I think he's terrible. And I can't stand those ways of fluffing him up and presenting him as if he's lovely, you know, like a lot of French people have done. No, it's a philosophy of mayhem and carnivalesque murder and torture of children, but you've got to give it to him. He knows what he's doing. And if someone knows what they're doing, well, you know, what can you say? Mm-hmm. You know, and you know, I don't know if you know this in de Sade, but in his books, there's kind of, they're terrible. I don't know if you've read any or not. They're just, as literature, they're just terrible. They're so boring. But what is interesting is the psychology at work. And what happens is, so you've got this great big, you know, torture scenario, mass murder, or whatever. And then some character comes up, stands forth and gives this little enlightenment speech about why this is all justified. And it's so crazy. And you think, yeah, that really is, I can really see. I think, you know, Spinoza mightn't think he's doing de Sade, but de Sade knows he's doing Spinoza. And I think he's right. That is right, because this is what we are. And I think in some weird and twisted way, de Sade and Augustine are like bookends of each other who actually share a great deal in common about what they see. In fact, this is not de Sade, this is someone else. I remember one part of Augustine. There's a passage, and I think I quote this in my book on Idolizing the Idea. It reads just like Nietzsche's Will to Power, and it's about plant life and nature. And I think, yeah, that's the nature red in tooth and claw part of us. It's part of us. And he sees that, and how we deal with that and try to build upon that without just caving into it and kind of provide, you know, rationalizations of diabolical and terrible things, but we present it as if this is natural and normal and good and healthy. I think that's the value of someone like Augustine.
Thank you so much, Wayne. And just touching upon that book, then, Idolizing the Idea, A Critical History of Modern Philosophy, I want to ask you a little more about that and how this elevation of the primacy of ideas, you say, in this ideological way that blinds us from real life, then how you've shown how that damages the individual and to some extent communities. But I want to ask you a bit more about that communal aspect and tying with what you said about de Sade there. Similarly, you seem to show in even people like John Stuart Mill how there's this kind of bipolarity, that we have this enlightened vision of free individuals, but it's so destructive, and it destroys communities. And I think we're seeing that now with this kind of shadow of the Enlightenment, where these communities are coming back with modern protests about these abstract identities and so on. Would you like to speak to that and how they sort of are related? Does that make sense?
Look, yeah. First thing, one of the drivers behind me doing this book, apart from, this existential and noticing the terrible things that people do in the name of ideologies, I just want to say that one of the things that we all do, and it was Rosenstock-Huessy was such a great teacher in, and this was one of those pivoting points. When I saw this, everything was different, and that is we look for things to divinize. We want orientation, which is an understandable thing, but then in seeking orientation, we elevate. This is idolatry. We elevate all these aspects of life or personalities, and we want to follow them. And philosophy is a terrible place in which that happens. So, you've spent 5, 10, 6 years reading Michel Foucault or Gilles Deleuze or Immanuel Kant or John. It doesn't really matter. They're all, to me, they're all the same. In that, I should say the students are all the same. Insofar as they go, this is the line. This is the truth. Again, we're getting this alignment. This is it. And if we could all do this, then we will, that's great. And some of them then, muddy the waters by, oh, it's so diversity, identity politics, diversity, in which actually there's no diversity. You actually suffocate it, the very word, which of course is the way evil works all the time. I'll give another example. People are often shocked about, Catholic priests being terrible. If you're evil, why wouldn't you become a priest? If you want to be a pedophile, that's the first job you should line up to. That's where you go. You'd be an idiot not to, and you take advantage of people's gullibility. It's true, I think, that we have lived in a time in which there's a great deal of gullibility, and I think the Enlightenment creates more gullibility even than the pre-Enlightened world, because it's true that in the pre-Enlightened world, people with their limited intellectual operations and their daily ritual, their rituals, the regular rituals, but the visceral nature of their life, I tend to think, and I would say this is not only Christian people, I would say I see this in all sorts of people from across the globe. There's a realism, there's a grit in their lives that makes them less susceptible. You could say, oh, they bought the big, the Enlightenment, they bought the big lie of religion, blah, blah, blah. But the thing is, whatever that religion is, it's done something over a very long period of time. It's worked. You can then say, that's that, your God, my God, this is where we differ, this or that. But they have managed to bond communities. Modern ideologies, which is really, modern ideological thinking is really a 19th century phenomenon. It comes out of philosophy. It comes out of ideas. So we move from this elevation of the idea, the way of ideas, as John Locke uses that term, and which is criticized then by Thomas Reid. We come out of the elevation, and then very quickly by the 19th century, everyone's speaking of alignments, going back to Descartes to Tracy, late 18th century, ideologies, and then it all lines up with different ideologies. So you go to an academic conference, someone's, I'm a socialist feminist, I'm a Marxist, this or that, I'm this or that. It's like good tinfoil hat stuff. And you talk about other people, wearing tinfoil hats and believing in conspiracies. This is to me is idolatry. And you think, okay, how have these ideologies succeeded or not in community building? And it doesn't matter whether we take Islam or Buddhism or Hinduism or Christianity, I would say they've all got a far superior track record to something like Marxism. So now, say with Marxism, like, you know, Zizek's really clever and blah, blah, blah. But at the end of the day, it's tweaking your nose or not being a Marxist. You know, it's when it suits him, and then it's not when it gets difficult. Because it's pretty hard to say, yeah, look, Stalinism was just so great. And it's very easy to forget that every Marxist in 1930, except from Trotsky and, you know, a hall full of people, maybe two hall full of people in the whole world, you know, wasn't a Stalinist. They were all Stalinists. We forget that. It's written out of history. It's forgotten, you know, nuts. So in terms of community building, what we're seeing is ideas becoming ideologies, and a plethora of ideologies, and these ever thinner requirements to form a community. You know, Larry David, who I like very much, but you know, one bit he talks about the ball community. He's always having a go at identity politics, even though personally I think he probably fits in there swimmingly well, and he kind of, but there's something in him. And I think the comic is very similar to the religious in this respect. I think that it's very interesting. I've found that the comic critique of philosophy and the religious critique of philosophy are pretty well identical. So if you look at Aristophanes or Lucian, and then you compare that to Harman, one of my favorite thinkers, Johann Harman, and his critique, or even Kierkegaard, you see they're very similar criticisms. They're trying to get you to get back to the real. So as these ideas become more and more, as they spread more and more, they take on more significance, they become greater sources of our veneration and ideolatry, and people defer to them. What you notice, of course, is people can't bear anyone not going along with the narrative. They have to lose their job. They have to be shut down. They have to be made to genuflect to this. And there's another aspect to it, which is just the bread and butter of human nature, and that is the self-interest, the vested interest, in Marx's term. And you know, there are things in Marx which, had he followed them through better, I'd go, that's great. And materialism of the sort that he was talking about is a good thing. It's just he oversimplifies it and doesn't go far enough. And he doesn't understand even, you know, again, I think of the Christian tradition. It's not a Platonic tradition. I heard your interview with Nick Wright. I think very much like Nick Wright along that, you know, it's some other thing. So there is a kind of bodily component all the way through this way of seeing, and that's how I think as well. So when you're looking at how an ideology takes over, you've got to look at what's the class doing it? What are the benefits of doing this narrative? What are they? So if the narrative becomes more simple and any idiot can learn it, you know, within a week or two, then surveilling other people, you can have a career. And, you know, HR, all these offices now open to you to do this. So it's very material. The narrative this is one good thing about Foucault. He was right onto the fact that what he calls discursive regimes were sociological. And when he was good and not trying to do metaphysics, which he was terrible at, and I'm not a big fan of metaphysics anyway, so him and his acolytes doing it is even more dreadful. But when he was very good, he was right on the money. And I think that is true about the way in which a narrative creates its object, and to protect the sacrosanct nature of the object, which gives you a purpose. So in some ways, ideology is also filling a spiritual hole. It's no accident, I think, that after the religious wars come, the ideological wars come. It's trying to fill this space and place in us, which needs to worship. And one thing I love about Christianity is, after me, that's it. You know, after Jesus, that's it. You can have saints and Mary and everything else, but no other God. You know, there's God, there's a Trinity. And I think that is very profound. And I do think all these people, they try to make gods of Judith Butler or Foucault, or watching them, you know, speaking about these people with such reverence. Look, I really love Rosenstock-Huessy. I've said that, but I'm very aware of his flaws, you know, and there's all sorts of things I wouldn't want to line up with him on. I think he gets it wrong. That's not, it. So to be able to like and admire someone, you know, I'm a guitar player, and one of the things I really love, and I've said this in a couple of things I've written, but I really love about musicians generally is they know where they're at. They know who's good, who's better than better, where they fit. But when it comes to ideas, you're either right or you're wrong. You're in the club or you're not in the club. And, you know, they then might defer to, you know, a Judith Butler and sit there, whatever, you know, being enamored by this. But at the end of the day, what they're really getting is just abstraction upon abstraction upon a very narrow bit. And if you want to blow open the conversation, and I'm terrible at philosophy conferences because I don't know where to begin with me, and I'm not even just talking, I just ask a question or two. It's like, you're not allowed to ask that. That doesn't, but this is the game. This is the game. You play the game this way. And of course, life doesn't dictate what the game is. I mean, look, life is serious. There's games and there's non-games, but it's not like a game of chess because there's too many possible encounters and things that you don't expect, consequences you don't expect. So when people are following ideas and trying to use that as a way of binding communities, it's so threadbare. This is why I think the hostility towards those that won't accept the sacrosanct nature of their narratives has to be met with real force. And this is a terrible thing. So I'm not sure if I've moved away from your original question or not, but I don't think that communities can be bound, serious communities. So when I hear people talking about a community of color or a community of women, to me, it's as sensible as the community of the bald. I think it's rubbish. I think it's not true. And you know it's not true because as soon as some woman or someone of the same color speaks out against that, the line that is supposed to bond, the narrative is supposed to bond them, they get picked on. So, you know, someone like Candace Owen is, she's not really black. Or I really love Karen Kennedy. You know, I know you've talked about race stuff. I don't know if you know her. She's fantastic. Do you know her stuff at all, Karen Kennedy?
Actually, no.
Oh, she's so, I just like to put her in a ring with any of the, you know, sharp as a tack, wrathful. She's rough. And her story came out of the fact that her husband had been a military officer and who died and trying to get a pension from the Democrats at the time. I don't want to go into that too much. I just wanted to say that's an example of someone. I mean, she's not very well known. She gets very few YouTube hits. And of course, with what YouTube has done now, a lot of people like that, they've just disappearing. So this narrative can exist. So it's really, to put another, this is so the ideolatry and the priesthood of these particular pathetic idols can exist. But if you're telling me that all, you know, I speak on behalf of women, I speak on behalf, you're joking. I can't speak on behalf of myself from 1 minute to the next. You know, how this can be taken seriously by journalists. I just find this astonishing. It's why I write that thing on the dialectic of imbecility. I can't, you know, this is Alice in Wonderland lunatics. So anyway, sorry.
Well, thank you very much, Wayne. And then I think parallel to this kind of political element, and they all overlap as I think comes across in your work and they're interrelated, but is the kind of new metaphysics pioneered by people like Descartes. And I want to ask you a little bit about him and why you place him at the center, even more so than figures like Bacon, and maybe then sort of tying it to the modern scientism, as it were, which I suppose elevates that idea that Paul Kingsnorth has described, especially with COVID, how it's kind of apocalyptic. It's unveiled these things to us that had been there all along. And would you like to speak to that a little bit?
Yeah. Well, me giving that particular position to Descartes as the first centerpiece of modern metaphysics. that's nothing unique to me. Martin Heidegger does that. I agree with Heidegger, but I think the more history of philosophy you read, you can see that a figure like Francis Bacon, he's got a project that you can identify with the modern project. But the way he goes about it, this was, by the way, Ernst Cassirer, who's a very good, I think, historian of philosophy, who was very, a fan of the Enlightenment. And he gives it a really good run. I love Cassirer, really. I think he's a really decent human being, and etc. He points out that there's a lot in what Bacon does is still Aristotelian, even the way he classifies types. Now, later we will see with figures like Herder, for example, that certain sciences never really are commensurate or consistent with the kind of apodictic requirements of physics that the Cartesian metaphysics is meant to lay down. And so that looseness, so it's like even in politics, for example, it's no accident that Aristotle can still be spoken about seriously by political scientists, whereas you can't speak about Aristotle in any serious way with physics. Now, that's politics, but even with other kind of sciences, the experimental method of, some people want to say play off the experimental method of Bacon with Aristotle, but that's not really true. Aristotle is observing things, as you know. He was interested in botany, and he was looking at living forms, and his whole approach to stuff is morphological. But Bacon did join the anti-Aristotelian push that was commonplace, had a lot to do with what was happening in the institution. Now, Descartes, one thing I think, which was why this is a complicated story. I don't just see Descartes as bad, I really like lots of it, but there's a lot of it I also don't like. But he comes out of the 30 Years' War. He comes out of the religious wars that have culminated in this horror show, and he's looking for a new way. And the way he is, this meditation upon himself, and then to find certainty with his hyperbolic doubt. And he ends up coming up with the things that I think are decisive is a view of all of reality, so a view of all of reality in which we can find our orientation if we get the right method. That, I think, is what's decisive. Whereas with Bacon, you're still doing this little bit of reality over here. This, I'm going to, freeze this chicken. He's part of a general experimental I want to say technological, but I don't want to think 19th, 20th century, small techniques, technology, little things, observing. He's part of that. And Descartes, to some extent, but it's Descartes' picture of the entire universe, of him positioning himself over that entire universe, kicks off all these metaphysical disputations, which they agree about all the fundamentals that really matter, and then where their disputations are, I don't think that really. For example, Spinoza is an anti-dualist. Yeah, but he begins life as a Cartesian, and what he has in common with Descartes is basically a faith in science. This is the critical thing, that all the things that most matter will be solved through the scientific method. Now, in the case of Descartes, the whole end of it he lays out, and it's so prescient, is comfort. It's just a comfortable life. And that's where, I hear someone saying at various conferences, I'm not comfortable with you saying that. It's like, Descartes, why should you be comfortable about what I say? I'm not comfortable about what I say. I'm embarrassed about what I say. I'm shocked with what I say. I'm angry with what I've said. And I'm really angry with what you said, blah, blah, blah. But I'm really comfortable with what you said. God, that's terrible. That's really, there's no spirit there. If there's something cozy and comfortable, justify that at the end of the day in a kneiper, little warm, cup of cocoa and a pipe or something. That's sweet, but it's not serious. That's just the interlude. But Descartes takes, this idea of what would normally be the interlude. So he wants to extend life forever. which is what we're living in now. It's a nightmare. It's just a horror show. I don't think, Descartes doesn't think that Pascal thought. Pascal knew. Descartes a horror. He's got God flicking it, and then he gets out of the way, and what's going to take place? And then all this nonsense about what God in Descartes, and even close friends of mine want to take Descartes as a religious thinker seriously. And Jean-Paul Bell, Jean-Luc Marion, and people like that too. I just can't get it. I can't get it. I mean, there's nothing in this God except it holds the universe together. That's it. You can pray to that. What are you going to pray? Please keep holding it together. He will hold it together. There can't be miracles since Descartes. So, Pascal gets it. Pascal is a soul man, it's between dust and the infinite. And Descartes is a founder of behavioral biology. He's going to get us all comforted together. Now, coming out of the 30 Years' War, I think that's a really understandable reaction, and wanting to fix that, and had Descartes modified the aims a bit, I'd have no problems with it. So, yes, Descartes is very clever, but at the end of the day, Locke, Descartes, Leibniz is a one exception for me. I've always got a soft spot. I think he's the most genius. I've got a pretty, what's the word? I don't really like metaphysics, but with Leibniz, I'm so intrigued by the genius of it. I'm happy to, yeah, sure. If it's Leibniz and metaphysics, it's completely crazy, but it's so beautiful. And maybe, who knows, it's just wonderful. So I think there's no getting around Descartes to understand the modern story, but you can't understand the modern story without understanding the explosion of the religious wars and what's gone wrong there. So at some point you could say, it's just sin, it's just our mess ups. And we're dealing with that, and the church was doing a pretty good job in some ways, but then it couldn't last. And then when there's reading people like Hilaire Belloc or Chesterton, they give a very good argument for what was lost with the fragmentation of the church. I think that's true. But at the same time, given what, the killing of Huss, for example, the memory that people, Jan Hus, and the memory that people have, and the way in which that elite had, in a sense, betrayed its mission, it's understandable why there would be these reactions. So to me, it's all an unraveling of what we are. And that's what we've got to face up to. Every age, every time has just got to face up to, this is what we are. How can we bind ourselves together in a more convivial way in trying to build a future together? Not, I end up finding myself ever closer to conservatives, even though I don't think of myself as conservative. I'm not socially conservative. But at the same time, I don't like the way in which our institutions are just ripped up and torn up by any act of will. And instead of being appreciative of the fact that metanoia, that sometimes you have to leave, sometimes you have to leave something and venture into new seas. But that should be done with great conditions. That's, should be done with hesitation. And if you leap, well, there can be mighty falls. Be careful where you leap. That's what I think.
Thank you, Wayne. And then what partial help do persons like Thomas Reid, who you mentioned previously and in the book, offer then, in contrast to much modern philosophy in this kind of way of ideas, of course, to its own detriment, as we're saying?
Well, when I wrote the book, I had intended to have another third of the book. And then I was intending to do possibly a second volume as well. And the publisher said, look, first of all, who the hell are you? And we usually only have 100,000 words. We'll let you have 150, but you can't do 200,000 words. And it's like, well, there was a seam there, and that seam was the thinkers that follow on from Reid, that I think offer a better way of integrating the human sciences and philosophy, and for different ways. And they're Vico, Harman, and Herder, which of course Isaiah Berlin wrote, on them. And he's better in some aspects than others, but the general thing about Berlin is Berlin really sees irrationalism as a force that leads to National Socialism. I think this is a very shallow diagnosis that he offers. And I just think it's just, yeah. And, what's very interesting about the, how the French and the Germans is after the French anti-Nazis, they were all, more or less all, in what you'd have to call, if you use that dyad, and it's not a very helpful one, they're in the irrationalist camp. A guy like Georges Bataille, for example, well, just a whole stack of them. They have, from a German perspective, they look more like the fascists. This is why Habermas, when he wrote that book, I don't like Habermas very much, but it doesn't matter. He wouldn't like me, so I don't care. But he's Habermas. But his philosophical discourse of the moderns, very early on, he's criticizing the post-structuralists. This was in the mid-80s, and he's criticizing it because they're rationalist. What he's saying is that what they're doing is power and irrationality. And the German position was that, which is in George Lukács's The Destruction of Reason. I mean, Lukács is a complete monster and lunatic, but nevertheless, he wants to ally himself with that rationalist tradition and the irrational, because the Nazis are the irrational. Well, yes, some of it's completely nuts, and no way you could call it reasonable. But, they tried to provide a science of race, and, they tried to all sorts of nonsense under the, and people can do anything they like with science. So I don't think that really, it doesn't really work that way. So just coming back a bit. So the book, I had to leave those guys out. But the reason I included them is because I think that unless you take into account, and I'm not the Lone Ranger here, they've said it, and a lot of other people are doing it, but you need to look at the sociological, you need to look at the economic. That's less so those guys, the economic, but that's something Marx brings in, but he gets it from all these other political economists, and that's really important. You need to look at those things. You need to look at anthropology, and you need to understand, and this is where I think Herder gives a great defense of this, because his position is all of our knowledge, including metaphysics, it's in movement. And as it moves, we've got to constantly reconsider everything. And the value of metaphysics for Herder is that it's a way of organizing information. And I think, if that's what it is, that's great. Then you can talk about it's not quite the same as epistemology. And, epistemology versus ontology and all this, let's just come back a bit and just say, they're people, we're all people here, trying to make sense of our world, and all sorts of things are very relevant in trying to make sense of it. And culture is one of them. Again, culture is a word that is so frequently used to create brainlessness, like at my last university, which I'm still an adjunct, but I'm sure no one will be watching this. But they introduced a course called Cultural Intelligence, and I was forced at gunpoint, which is why I ended up retiring over this, but I was forced at gunpoint, basically, to mark the stuff in this, and it was just complete stupidity. And it was not because they didn't learn anything about any other cultures. If you actually go and learn about other cultures, that's great, but they didn't learn anything about any other culture. It was all about safe spaces and respect for other. It was all in the abstract. There was nothing real, and there was no intellectual challenge at all. It was just an induction program into this modern, disastrous way of thinking. So, culture, that's what I want to say. Herder is really great at making us think about our different communities and culture. And I think he does a much better job of it than Hegel. It's interesting, Hegel doesn't even mention Herder in his history of philosophy. Now, we know he read Herder, and he takes a lot from Herder. And I've always thought, I think Hegel is really great. And if the world were a philosophy writ large, he'd be your man, but it's not. It's a mess. And Herder is your man because it's a mess. Now, he is very optimistic and he's very providentialist. And, you know, Mondays, Wednesdays, and Fridays, I'm a providentialist, but the other days, far less. I just fully fallen, you know. God help us. So Herder's teacher, who doesn't, he's operating with a whole other set of questions, but Harman, to me, I just love Harman. I really love him. And Harman, I think he gives you the most powerful case. And it's not through such an argument, it's just the way he sets things up. And he tweaks noses, he has a lot of fun, he's very playful, he's big influence on Kierkegaard, because like Kierkegaard, he wears all these masks. He's very playful. He hates metaphysics with a passion. But his story was he had gone off to London working on behalf of someone in his company, and he had basically spent all the money carousing and playing lute, and a friend of his who had had a sexual relationship where he was being paid for it, and that horrified Harman. And Harman just ended up, you know, broke and despondent, and he picked up the Bible and he saw his life in the Bible. And you think that, now when you think of that, this is the way a hermeneutical understanding of things works, because it's not an argument. Obviously, he doesn't think he's Adam or Eve, you know, the imagination is active. Now, the truth of that book to him cannot be cashed out in the way that Ricky Gervais, is really funny, but when he mocks the Bible, I'm just sort of, I feel sorry for him, because I think he's a reasonably intelligent guy, just being stupid. And it's being stupid because, you know that that's not a book that was written as a scientific treatise. You know, it's very different to the Greek way of thinking about things. Its meaning is there from the outset. The goodness of life is there from the outset. It's a proclamation. It's a proclamation. And it's a way in which communities are being bound together over multi generations, over through various voices. And then, unbeknown to anybody who's contributing to that book, except God, perhaps, but that's okay. But any person contributing to that book, any human person, I can just see theological conundrums about it. In this room in London is this guy in complete despair, completely broke. He spent the company's money. He's caroused. He's made a mess of his life. He doesn't know what to do. And he opens his book and he sees it speaks to him. So you can't compare that. That's not a book of some, it's not like a Platonic philosophy. It's not like Hume would speak to you, or Hegel. And Hume can speak to you. Hegel, they can, but it's not like that. That's a different thing. And it's speaking in terms of overpowering, overwhelming images, and there's this kind of soulful connection, which, and as far as Harman would be concerned, I think this is absolutely right. When someone else opens a Bible, what they're going to find that is going to trigger all these other things in them, because it has that potency. And one of the reasons I think it's got that potency is just because of the conditions under the experience, the range of experiences it addresses. It's just the most astonishing book. No book that I am aware of can be compared to the Bible in terms of its power. And I'm someone that doesn't spend all my life reading the Bible, or, you know, even much of my life reading, but every time I come near it, I'm aware. It's like, you know, when I said, you know, Hegel and Fichte in the bookshelves coming down, well, the Bible, kind of potency in this book. And Harman's way of getting people to understand this sacred source, in some ways, what Herder is doing with different cultures is trying to find what is it that gives people a reason for their being. What is it that they hold as sacred? What defines them? What will they give their lives up for? What they kill for? will they marry into, you know, all of this? What will they do that? And that's where we've got to start with. And I think that is the beginning of a much more dialogical approach. And then people like Rosenstock-Huessy, Franz Rosenzweig, Martin Buber, the various others, that's they're positioning themselves in this way of thinking in which it's not like they're all trying to fit it all into their brain, though in some ways they are, but they're not. In fact, that's a great thing about Rosenstock-Huessy and Rosenzweig. I'm not saying they always kept to it, but they, and certainly almost none of their readers do this, but they see themselves operating on different fronts and addressing different fronts. Now, even on a front, you're only seeing so much. So it's an open-ended invitation, but it's an open-ended invitation in which they're addressing different fronts, but at the same time, I mean, Rosenzweig writes this book, The Star of Redemption, in which the core argument is really all these other peoples were not interested in doing redemption. So, of course, North American liberals hate him for saying that. I find myself in, I find my book on these guys, it's trotted out regularly as, you know, oh, he's anti-Muslim and blah, blah, blah. It's like, you don't get it at all. I just don't think in those terms. I think you're a complete idiot in thinking that way. Mm-hmm. No, what Rosenzweig is saying in this book is no one else except this people were interested in this. They were interested in this. Now, he might have polemic in that, but he's right about that. And then you can argue whether that's worth it or not. You can argue about redemption or not redemption. And the argument, the case he makes about why Islam is not a religion of redemption under the terms that he defines redemption, I think that's compelling. I think it's a very compelling argument. But I do remember when I was in Turkey, and I gave a talk about the discussion between Rosenstock-Huessy and Rosenzweig within the Jewish Christian tradition of how that could be a way of the kind of encounter in which there's a great deal of disputation, not just agreement, which is, you know, the agreement of the, what do you call it, the interfaith stuff, which is I have no time for, because they're all agreeing. No, Rosenstock and Rosenzweig, they write these incredibly hostile letters to each other, but there's a love that binds them in that because they're really searching for the truth in that. And in this, and I said, this is not the way. And at one stage, one of the guys, it was very interesting because the body language, because they were intrigued by what I was saying, though it was being translated, so I don't know what they got. The girls were up one side and the guys were up there, they're sitting back and they're not sure, Jew and Christian. But one guy goes, do you think had Rosenzweig lived long enough, he would have become a Muslim? Which I thought was very interesting because he saw something that attracted him and he could only see that. And there was a pride, you know, there's a pride in that. That's fine. That's good. And when we can have a conversation, what is you proud about? You know, because in the West, everyone's ashamed. There's nothing but shame is what. But and a certain degree of shame is good, but when it's, you know, when you're ashamed because you're too good, then that's not good. You know what I mean? You know, the people that are ashamed are people who think now they're so morally pure that somehow these past crimes and sins have nothing to do with the fact they're going to Yale or Harvard and they've got the wealth they've got, and they will. People are capable of an infinite delusion. Anyway, so with Rosenstock and Rosenzweig in this encounter, what we're seeing, and at one point, so Rosenzweig says the Christians and the Jews are the only people of redemption, but the dangers facing the Christian tradition, he goes through and says these dangers, that leaves the Jews. So the Jews are the last one standing. But he also says elsewhere in a letter, he says, you know, a lot of people didn't get it. My whole point was Christianity is based upon a lie. Now, there's another interesting bit in the conversation in the letters of 1916 with Rosenstock, where Rosenzweig said, and our people were right to crucify Jesus and we would do it again. And Rosenstock just said, come on, Franz, you wouldn't crucify him again. You wouldn't crucify anybody. Let's not be stupid here. And I thought that was a great response. But you can see that. So my point about this is, here are people that simultaneously agree and disagree. And this is the kind of world that we're living in now. We have to be able to do that. But to try and smooth over that through a lie, and that's what I think our liberal culture is, just a lie, by setting up a false and very abstract consensus. And yes, we'll all love those people, provided, provided they'll accept the fact that we can give our children, various blockers of their sexual, their natural sexual identity as we help them. And if they accept, are you kidding? You think traditional people think that's a good idea? You think you've got anything in common with them? And the one thing they've got in common with you is they're very happy to see you attack your tradition, because that makes you vulnerable. You will be geopolitically vulnerable. And of course, so much of what we're talking about is geopolitical, and so few people talking from the platforms of Harvard or Yale or these universities, or they don't do any serious geopolitical thinking at all. They're not interested in the hells that are being created through conflicts within the Islamic world, pan-Islam. They're not interested in China's aspirations, our weaknesses, Russia's. They will happily, accuse Russia of, tampering with an election in 2016, but they're not serious about what that means. They have no idea. They can simultaneously say in one breath, we're all for peace, and then be fueling a new Cold War. And you think, what's going on here? But my point is, the geopolitical dimension is every bit as important as the existential dimension, as the communal dimension. All of these things, if anyone is being thoughtful, they have to be thinking about all these things at once, because we're still never going to get enough information. We'll still generalize and fill in gaps falsely. And if we're lucky, in a discussion, someone will say, yeah, but what about this? And you go, oh, yes, okay. Because we're all learning on the go. But again, we're living in an age where people want leaders to come and save us. The Führerschaft principle has become, fascism, I think, was the victorious ideology overall. It's reconfigured in a more globalist form. It's transnationalist, but it's the corporate state with the leadership principle, cultural leaders. We've got an office of leadership in my last unit. They're everywhere. Leaders. An idiot vice chancellor sent a thing around a few months ago saying, "Oh, I love leadership, and everyone can be a leader." And this is the language of the devil, really. If you didn't believe in the devil, this should make you believe in the devil.
Thank you for that, Wayne. I want to ask you next, if I may, actually in line with this in part, I think, about Nietzsche. So you've said you've written so much about Nietzsche, you studied Nietzsche in depth, and I think you also show quite brilliantly that there's actually a link between him and Plato more than he'd probably like to admit, and that even those who...
Between him and Plato?
Yes. And that sort of idealist way of living, and that even those who feign to be about life, say like Nietzsche, Foucault, people like that, that they can still idealize that idea and take us away from real life. Would you care to speak to that a wee bit? And
yes. In some ways, so when I started writing this book, very early on, I'm sure I quote Nietzsche and Marx or mention them in passing, to the effect that they've, and in the case of Marx, is a reiteration of Feuerbach. So like Harman, and I'll just say, just to clarify something too, those that last part of the book did appear in the magazine The Postal, just in case anyone's interested in that bit. And the reason I'm mentioning that is because a lot of what Nietzsche said is prefigured in Harman, but I think Harman gets it without an idealist sullying of the truth, just as Marx reproduces Feuerbach, and Feuerbach does kind of end up becoming a precursor of kind of dialogical philosophy much later in the I and thou stuff, which Buber repeats. So in the case of, it's real living human beings, Marx. It's the same with Nietzsche's anti-Platonism. They all seem great. But then it comes to here, this is the problem in Nietzsche's case. It's the whole problem is one of Platonism writ large. That's what he sees the problem, which he sees obviously Christianity and Plato being one, which is, I think, nonsense, but he sees it. But then when you are what he goes, so what we need to do is find the truth that we will create. We need we need philosophers of the future. That formulation was also in Feuerbach, but it's a similar thing. We need philosophers of the future. And it's basically what he's saying is we need a great idea to live by. And that great idea will be the Superman. Now, it's true that he doesn't put a lot of detail in it, just in the same way Marx doesn't put a lot of detail into communism. But to me, let's go to Marx for a moment. The idea that you're supporting a kind of end game, but you don't bother running critical models around what it might look like, strikes me as asinine. You've criticized a society that exists because an existing society is going to be riddled with flaws. And then you're coming up with something that's little more than a word and a few sentences. And you wanting people to steal, seize property, bind it. This is stupidity. And now we get to Nietzsche. It's just like the Superman. And you're supposed to get. I love Chesterton, by the way. That little essay on Chesterton where he has a Superman born in some little place in Croydon, and there's some feathered creature, and the parents are protecting it from the don't open the window or the draft will kill it. And I think that's really true. Nietzsche's come up with something sacrosanct. What is it? What is it? Is it Nietzsche running around with his knobbly knees, can't even Nietzsche with women, for example. That's a Superman. That's a precursor to Superman. You've got to ask your mate, will she go out with you? Will she marry you? That's pathetic. Freddie, up your game. No wonder, Lou Salom didn't want to be around Fred, too long. She ran off Paul Ray, and then even old Freud was better than him, It's just terrible. And so it's all this, bug-eyed, this grand vision, and it's just you're completely deluded. Just so this idea, and you fill it out, and then another one, the eternal recurrence. So we've got to have a myth, and any myth that someone designs as a myth is going to be a terrible myth, because that the way myths develop organically through stories is through shared experiences. So those shared experiences lead to reflections, and a myth is just another word for story. It's only with Plato, and that's another thing. Plato's this hard truth versus myth thing. Now that's we first see that in Plato it's at the end of I think it's the end of the Republic, or it could be the Gorgias. So it's a while since I've read this stuff, a long while, but he said, this is not, I'm pretty sure it's talking about the myth of Earth. This is not a myth. It's not just a story. It's something true. So he's contrasting the truth versus myth. And this then, of course, and we know in the case of Plato, that sets the philosophers against the poets. And of course, Aristotle, smart guy that he is, saying, let's reconcile this before it gets too out of hand. I think that's very smart. But by the time of Nietzsche, of course, as we got a more ideaist, a more, the way of ideas has, and you mentioned Thomas Reid before, and I never really answered that. Thomas Reid rightly saw a continuum of the philosophical position moving from the metaphysical disputations to the world. And he said, this is the wrong way around. We've got to come from the world back to what we've got. And the world, we understand it partially, but we understand it in language. That's why language and our community are going to be the main things. He didn't do that much with it. People like Herder do a lot more. And to some extent, Vico's reading of history is a beginning of that too, in a more detailed way. I don't think, I'm not sure if Reid and Vico are in any way remotely aware of each other's writings. I'm just trying to think of who precedes whom. I think they're roughly contemporaneous to things. But anyway, that's one way of doing it. So Nietzsche gives you the impression that he's going from the world to, but it's so schematic. So he's got master morality, slave morality. Everything's a schema. And it's the schemas that are the problems. They're the, the ideas writ large. And as I said, to use ideas, because we do use ideas, that's fine. The thing is not to idolize them. And in fact, with names and with language, we can move effortlessly between them, happily admit that we've come this far with this, that this is not far enough, we might need to ditch it. A developmental understanding in which it's not always maybe getting better, we're still over something. This is Herder's position, the hermeneutical position, Haman's position. We need to have a sense of that. So there's bits and pieces of that in Nietzsche, but I think he becomes prey to his own idol, and that's himself. And what he thinks, culture was really, it was all about high culture. And to me, this is a bit like, a kid getting enthused about boys' own manuals or something, oh, yeah, he's so great. Oh, come on, grow up a bit, Fred, He would have done much better if he got married, had a few kids and got on with it. The daily tasks of things, and then you may not need that. You may not need all that nonsense. How about just try and contribute to a more convivial world? And then all the bigger picture stuff you'd find it dissolved. All the nonsense you've gone on with about cruelty, or the blonde beast. And then you've got people like Walter Kaufmann trying to clean up. Nietzsche says A, B, and C, and Kaufmann said, no, he doesn't really mean A, B, and C. He means F, G, and K. And he doesn't really mean that about the Chadal. No, sorry, Wally. He did mean it. He said it, and it was stupid. And we don't have to follow him, and we can look at Nietzsche and go, yeah, those bits are good. I mean, again, Rosenzweig and Rosenstock, they're very Nietzschean, Jew and Christian. They're very, and insofar as I see that he's saying making some very good critical points about that. And in some ways, Heidegger, because I'll bring him into it as well, because, Heidegger's lectures on the history of philosophy, in my opinion, Heidegger, Hegel, some people might make a case for Deleuze. They can make the case. I'm not really of that opinion. Some of it's good, but it's all pretty wild in the case of Deleuze. But Heidegger and Hegel are fantastic readers of the history of philosophy. They are interested in their problems, but they certainly find grist for their mills in them. And so when you read Heidegger and Nietzsche, he's a fantastic reader of Nietzsche, as he is of everybody. I read a lot of his lectures. I'm not a disciple by any means. Again, in the book, I give Heidegger a good pasting, mainly for ignoring real history in favor of metaphysical history, given that your whole project is to criticize metaphysics. And then you go, oh, real history, we're not interested in that. We're only, I thought, what? That's your problem, buddy. You are where you are because of real history, and metaphysics might play a part in the modern world, but it doesn't exhaust it. And what you're saying is my account should be exhaustive. And that again is the idolatry, the pride behind these projects. So Heidegger also, for me, is every bit as guilty as Nietzsche. Now, this starts to look like a game, and I'm aware of it. And it's kind of, Derrida plays that game too. Oh, metaphysics didn't really end with them. I'm the real ender of metaphysics. And then he goes on. I don't care about that. I don't want to set myself up. Cristaudo has ended metaphysics. That's great. Come and look at my. I'm famous, and if you want to send money to my credit card, I'll give you the card number now, and let me have all the fame and glory because I've ended metaphysics. No. To me, that Nietzsche did it once, and then Heidegger doing it twice. Anyone else doing it is rubbish. But the more serious thing is, look, metaphysics can help find a way to begin to make sense of the big picture. but be very aware that it's only of heuristic value. And the more you know, that you're going to have to depart with that. You're going to have to let go of it. And to try, then this is, I think, a really important distinction between the tradition of revelation and the philosophical tradition, and why I think the revelation tradition, and this was something one philosopher, that is Schelling, who also plays a pretty important part in my book. Although he does metaphysics, a bit like Leibniz, I think he's a pretty glorious metaphysician. I think he's really great. But at the end of the day, the philosophy is serving the revelation. So the philosophy, and I think that's the way it has to be, because the tradition of revelation is going, big world, pea brains. And any kind of attempt to lay out exactly what we should do through a definitive ethics, a definitive political project, we can call that project or political program, is mad, because we don't know the consequences of what we've done. We know this in our life. I did something 20 years ago, and then I meet someone 20 years later and they said, what about this? And this caused this. And you don't know. None of us know. So we're all in a world where we're leaving traces of ourselves, dishevelment everywhere, maybe, convivial creations as well, and they're all acting upon things that we have no idea about. The tradition of revelation, I think, is a recognition that the truth is always coming towards us in unexpected encounters and ways that we can't close off. And if we close it off with some design, we're doing the world, ourselves, God, ourselves, great service. And I think it'll be diabolical. It doesn't matter whether your intentions are good. It doesn't matter, oh no, it's equality. It's going to be so good. No, you're just taking an abstraction. A friend of mine who'd written a very good book called Homo Americanus sent me this morning a review of a book on equality. And, one more thing on equality. It's just, and it's like, agonizing over it. No, look, people could talk about equality, but they're not serious. They're not really serious. We know every time we go to the shop, our penny is not capable of valuing things equally. So in our market transactions, it's not equal. Then we try to dream up schemes in which this output will advantage, this will do this. Again, you're not making it equal. You're just you're treating it like a mechanical bits of apparatus. And for very random and haphazard reasons, which you will give an account for, especially if your profession is to be the allocator of resources, or you want to be the allocator of resources, and you're trying to make your position as an academic have a more proactive role in dictating who gets what, where and how, what the criteria are. You can do all that. But dressing it all up under the notion of equality, really, you've got to be a child to take that seriously. And you can write a big fat tome and look with all this great, censoriousness. Oh, you're a terrible monster. You don't believe in equality. It's like, whatever.
I think that will be a good place to close for today. I think, Wayne, if that's all right, because I think I would love to look at your other books, but give them their due portion, if I might put it that way. So if you're happy to have another conversation, I'd be delighted.
Mark, I'm very glad I've met you. I can tell you that this might surprise you, but I don't often meet people who've read a line I've said. Anyone who wants to talk to me about it. So that's a wonderful thing. So I'll be very happy to. I'm sure now the books are going to sell by the truckload, and I'll be able to buy that high-watt amplifier I've been hanging out for.
I just want to ask you two questions.
I'm very, very happy to do that, Mark.
Fantastic. Thank you, and I appreciate it, and I appreciate your time today. I just want to ask you two quick questions then to allow people to find out a bit more about your work then. So one being, is there anything that you're working on now or something that you still feel the passion to get involved with in the future that you'd like to tell us about?
I'm in a state, I'm really doing musical projects at the moment. And for me, my life has always been academic music, then I stopped music. And this is one time where I put together an album that was started, the songs were written 25 years ago and the band recorded them 15 years ago, and then a terrible mix and a remix. And so I've just done that. And I'm a guy in New York who, I don't know if you know the singer-songwriter, he's one of my favorites, Sam Baker. He's a very interesting story. And I think his songs, this might interest, his songs are great insights into the spirit. He was blown up on a train in Peru by the shining light. And he survived, but all around him, people died. And his music reflects that. And I got in touch with the guy that produced an album of his, and he is now producing the recordings I'm doing. So that'll be coming out. And I'm working on some other music. And just on music, I'll just mention one other because these people inspire me too. A guy called Bill Fay. I don't know if you know him, F-A-Y. He had a record deal back in the 60s and was rediscovered in a very minor way, writing songs in his loft some, 10 or 12 years ago or 15 years ago. And he still just writes songs in his loft. And his songs are prayers. They're really prayers. They're beautiful, beautiful. So I like the fact that music can just go into places that are not too conceptual and so, but thoughtful. And so at the moment I'm working on that. I had intended to back up Idolizing with a volume 2, and I'm always saying I'm going to do X, then I don't do it. That to me is like God saying, yeah, big mouth, shut up, just do what you've done and then just move on where you're called. And I think and I hope that maybe when the time is right, I've also got a novel that it's a bit short and I wrote again, that's been sitting there, and a friend of mine actually translated that into French. He liked it. It's a bit like The Big Lebowski, so it's a kind of crazy novel. So I do want to go back and fix that up. And when the time is right, and I've also been thinking about doing podcasts. I see, but I'm not sure now I know you're out there. I'm not sure it's worth it. I don't know if I get anyone watching it. So I don't know if I will do that. So I'm thinking of that. I have been making, it's just a podcast. I've been doing a series of lectures and then that will go online. And I've actually given about 10 or 12 of them. And the idea of that was certain concepts which people take for granted, just giving people pause and thinking of how if you have a narrative and there's a core, there's a pillar of the narrative, say identity, but that concept's pretty hollow, then the whole thing falls apart. So that was the motive behind that. And that will come out. And a former student of mine, should I say this, who I helped save from prison. He's great. He's really lovely. No. Anyway, he's been very devoted to me and helping me put these together. So they will go online. I had thought of clearing up some lectures on the history of political thought where the microphones were terrible. And I went back and thought, can I clean these up? And I realized I can't clean this up there. It's just not only just too much work, they came out worse when I tried to clear them up. I just don't have the technology. So I just let them run, and I don't think I'll do them again. So now, in terms of writing, when I feel that there's a calling to write something, I want to be free, because I had all these other projects that I must write this, I must write that. I'm thinking, no, I'm in a clearing now, and if it comes, I've written a few chapters in books that have been requested of me. but not that I'm high in demand, but just people who know me said it'd be good if you contribute. And I like writing for the Postal, and I like Nermal and some other people I know through communication. So I'm always tempted to do something along those lines. And Nermal said, why not do something on music? And I might do something about that because it worries me that people who are terrific performers, say Bruce Springsteen, can speak about politics in a way which I think is just sloppy and slovenly, and it feels all gooey and nice, and then, but it just makes me, it's like treacle to me. If it's like the music of the most treacly music is when they speak politics, and I just, and it's taken seriously. So I'm very tempted to write something like that. Someone who didn't do that was Leonard Cohen, of course, because when he thought, he really thought. It didn't matter what he touched, it was always thoughtful. So I'm not sure what I'm going to do. It's waiting to be revealed. Thank you for asking. And again, I've gone on way too long.
No, thank you so much, Wayne, and thank you for joining me again today. And I should say, anybody that's looking a nice entry point into your work should definitely read the essays on thepostal.com and on Virgil and View as well. So I'd commend those.
There's a couple in there. I've not met, just through a few Virgil people helped me get 2 books published at a time of complete despair when I thought that I would never see the light of day. The one on Walter Benjamin and Charles Baudelaire, and the one on and Idolizing the Idea. And that was co-authored with a former PhD student of mine, and I couldn't stand the way Walter Benjamin was idolized so much. I think he's a very sad soul, so I wanted to give him a bit of a pasting using Charles Baudelaire.
Well, we can talk about that the next time, actually, if you're happy. Okay. That'll be great. Thank you so much, Wayne. God bless you.
Okay.
I'm going there. Nobody can stop me. Ooh, I'm going there.